Have you ever been caught red-handed? Like caught in the act of doing something that you were ashamed of? Um, I sure have. I can think of times I've been caught as a child and as an adult. And there are things that I'm probably too ashamed to say on public video. Anyways, I want you to think about that when you listen to this story. This is episode number 3 of Who in the World is Jesus? And we're going to be talking about a woman who is caught in the act of adultery. Okay? And it's a pretty intense story. And I just want you to just think about that. Think about what happened when you were caught doing something that you are ashamed of. I looked up being caught red-handed, and it actually was a term that was for a murderer, and a murderer in which the blood was still on their hands. So caught red-handed was like, okay, you were caught, and it was without a doubt that you're the one. Okay, so think about that, because we're going to go through the story right now, and we're going to see the way that Jesus handles this particular instance of someone being caught. Okay, so we're going to be starting in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, and let's get going. Okay, so Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple, and a crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. Okay, so Jesus, everywhere he went to this point, crowds were gathering. Okay, he didn't have to be in public too long before he was noticed, and the crowds were gathering. Okay, so this is just another instance of that. And as he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. All right, so another interesting story here, right in the Bible. Things that we probably wouldn't expect to be in here are in here. And Jesus is just hanging out, teaching a crowd. Religious leaders bring this woman in front of him and in front of the crowds, caught in adultery for a reason. Okay, they were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." All right, and this is a pretty popular saying, you know. He who has never sinned, throw the first stone. You may have actually heard that one in passing, and this is where it came from. So it says, they kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and he said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. When Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Okay, so a little bit of background. Jesus is at this point is gaining in popularity. Okay, he's actually in front or in the temple area where people, like the religious people, are gathering, and as soon as he shows up, a crowd gathers. Okay, and at this point in the story, he is drawing the attention of a lot of people, And the religious leaders are becoming a bit jealous, because instead of them getting the attention that they want, and the maybe religious orders of that day drawing the crowds, he's drawing the crowds, and there's this change happening. At this point, we're talking about some of the gatherings that were happening. Some of the crowds were up to 4,000 to 5,000 people, and in some of the stories they say, and that was counting only the men and not the women and children. So you can imagine that the crowds were getting pretty big. I don't know what the crowds were at this particular event, but the crowds were gathering, popularity is ensuing, and they are trying to squash Jesus and his influence on the crowds. And there's a couple of things going on here. They're bringing this woman in front of the crowds, but there's more than one reason. One of them is to condemn her for what she's been caught doing. But the other part is they're trying to catch him to make a division, almost like if they're trying to catch someone in their words and make a division in the crowd, because you have some religious people, like the real religious, the law said that if a woman is caught in adultery, you need to stone her. But then there's probably some other people that are more on the gracious side, and they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't accept a stoning of a woman. So they're bringing this woman into Jesus' presence and trying to get him to say something that's going to be divisive, so that they can break up the crowds and get some of them to side with them and some of them side with Jesus. And at this point, Jesus is just riding on the ground in the dust. Okay? Strange. Brings a woman. They're accusing her, asking what Jesus thinks about the situation. And Jesus is writing in the dust with his finger. And then they demand, it says that they demanded him to answer. And this is when he gets up and says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." Okay, so now he's putting it back into their court. Okay, he who has he who has no sin cast the first stone. And then he gets back down, squats down, and starts writing in the dust with his finger again. And it said that one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, they all walked away. So at this point in the story, there's some conjecture as to what actually happened. What was he writing in the dust? And I don't know what exactly he was writing in the dust. My guess is that he was probably writing their sins in the dust in front of each one, from the oldest to the youngest, one by one. Okay? So they bring this woman around this crowd. Crowds are gathering. And then you have the religious crowd gathering too that's condemning. And then there's this poor woman, like, probably just, I don't know, how do you even feel when you've been caught in the act of adultery? And there must have been so many things racing through her mind, whether she was going to be condemned, what her punishment was going to be. Not good. She was probably feeling really, really insecure at that moment. And Jesus, my guess, starts writing the sins of each one of the religious leaders, one by one, in front of them in the dirt. And probably as they start looking down and reading what he's writing, they're just like, oh, dang, this guy's got my number. And sure enough, one by one, they all start leaving. And I can imagine that there were probably some of them that probably took off before Jesus had a chance to write with his finger in the dirt about them. I know that if it was me and I was accusing, I would probably hightail out of there really quick. So one by one, they all leave. But then there's this crowd around Jesus and then this woman. And he gets up again and he said, "Woman, where are your accusers now?" And that final line that they said was, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Wow. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was caught red-handed as a child or even as an adult for some of the things I've done, it didn't quite go that way. I don't know the way that Jesus, he just does things in a whole different way that we would never expect. This woman at this point goes scot-free with the command, "Go and sin no more." Interesting story, right? Probably one that we wouldn't expect to see in the Bible. If I could take a couple of things from this story and kind of apply it to us in our day and age, this is what it would be. Jesus has a way of coming to us in such gentleness that he changes us with his love instead of his condemnation. And this probably doesn't make any sense to anybody, because I think that most of us think, when we think of Jesus, we know that he was a loving man, but it just doesn't seem right. You know, when you think about religion and all this rigidity that we know about, this is Jesus. This is how he acted. And I know that in my personal life, that when I have sinned, when I have come to him, or even when I just feel like, sometimes I just feel like, I just know that that God's putting his finger on something in my life, you know, like I've done something wrong. I've acted in a way that was wrong to someone, maybe just didn't treat them right, and just felt like, oh God, I need to make this right. And I got to tell you, 9 times out of 10, when Jesus comes, he comes with gentleness and humility and says, "Go and sin no more." Okay, this is the Jesus that I'm talking about. This is the one that we use as a curse word. This is the one that we know as some kind of religious leader. This is the one that people have crosses on their chest for and tattoos on their body about. This is the one. Okay? Point number 2. A little harder to swallow. But if you are the judgmental type, Jesus has your number too. Okay? Nothing goes out of his sight. Nothing goes under the radar. Okay? He knows the ins and the outs. And it's a good thing. Being known is good. I would rather bring my ugly to Jesus and have him make it right than to be living in my ugly. So if you are the condemning type, keep track, because you're being kept track of as well. And there's forgiveness for our keeping track. So we've talked about 3 people so far. We've talked about Simon Peter. He was the one that was in the boat and got all those fish. Kind of interesting story. We've talked about the woman in the well, who Jesus told her everything that she ever did and exposed her in a way that brought life to her. And now we've talked about the adulterous woman that was caught in the act and brought before Jesus. Are these stories that you expected to find out about when we started the series? Is this the Jesus that you thought you knew? I would love to hear it in the comments. So if you could do me a favor, comment, subscribe, like. Those things keep this video at the top of the list for me. And if you think this is important information for others to know about, it is so helpful. And we're trying to reach a generation that really doesn't know about Jesus. This whole series is specifically for people that don't really know who Jesus is and maybe aren't even interested. So I appreciate you guys' support so much. Next week, we are going to talk about a man that was born blind, and what happens in his life when he comes across Jesus. Once again, it's going to be a little gritty, because the religious people are getting upset again in this next story. So there's some heroism. And there's some meanness that's going on in this next story. So appreciate you guys taking the time. We'll see you in the next one.